So right now we're gonna do our open data panel to talk about how we can leverage all those information assets that we have at our disposal, obviously with an API bent. But for that purpose, we have here Kin Lane, who's going to be moderating. I don't know, should I say API evangelist or the API? I'll say the API evangelist, as many of you who have been working with APIs may know him. He's, astounds me with the amount of information that you can pump out there and all the the community that you bring together. It's incredible. So, we're very privileged to have you here as the moderator. I'm feeling beard envy as well. I think Irakli said, oh, you're going to go up to Ken on the beard. I said, no, give me 15 years. Maybe I can get there. Anyway, so Ken's going to moderate, and I'll let you introduce all the panelists.
Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and bring them on up. Come on up, guys. This is good. Kick this off. So this is going to be more of a conversation than a panel. So I welcome all of you to participate and just raise your hands. Rather than having Q&A at the end, just interject and come on up, you guys. Oh, I thought they were going to give you guys lapel mics, but I guess we all have our own mics, so it'll work out pretty good. All right, so my name's Kin Lane. I'm the API evangelist. So I don't actually evangelize for any single API. I evangelize for all APIs equally. So, yeah. I don't work for anyone. I guess I work for everyone, all the API providers. Layer 7, Apogee, all of them. I was just in Apogee. I love APIs in San Francisco. I think it was yesterday or the day before. But anyways, alrighty. So what we're going to talk about today is open data, which is kind of interesting because I think both of those are kind of loaded terms, and together it's kind of loaded as well. So, but we're going to talk APIs later in the afternoon. If you're here at 3:30, I'm going to have an open API conversation, which is another set of kind of BS terms too. But anyways, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves because I don't think I'll be able to do it justice. So go ahead, take it away, Stephen.
Sure. I'm Steve Davenport. I'm with the World Bank Group. My focus is on digital engagement, or putting this data to work in development. My hobbies are the Open Contracting Data Standard, which is another piece of work by the bank. And again, I can speak a bit to some practical use around open data, given that it was a strategic priority for the bank for a few years now.
Was or still is?
I'm sure you'll ask me that question.
I'm Alex Howard. I'm an independent writer and analyst here in DC. I contribute to Tech Republic and Tech President. Previously, I was a researcher at Columbia University's Tao Center for Journalism, Digital Journalism. I did research on data journalism, and up at Harvard at the Ash Center on network transparency. And previous to that, just where I got to know Kin Lane and a lot of the people here and elsewhere, I was O'Reilly Media's Washington correspondent, and in a previous life, I'd be encouraging you to go buy O'Reilly things. Now I'll just say that the books are really useful, and I'm glad to hear that they're still getting attention here. And I get to write about the fellows to the left and right of me a fair bit too. So that's my place in this ecosystem.
I'm Ian Schuler. I'm CEO of Development Seed, which is a small tech shop here in DC that works with governments, international NGOs, civil society organizations to better use data to solve the problems that they're trying to solve. And so we are sometimes a consumer of APIs and open data, and sometimes working with groups like the World Bank to take the data they have and unlock it and make it available to more effectively achieve their social outcomes. And so we are sort of bridging the kind of private sector focus on this, but also really deeply embedded with work with the social sector and how they use data to affect change. And I've worked previously in both NGOs and in government, and so come with those sort of perspectives of how you actually make change within those groups.
I think that's a good segue into, I want to kind of ask the audience here, raise a hand, who's a government employee? Wow, interesting. Okay. Out of everyone else, who primarily works for government? Contracts? All right. And then the rest, I'm assuming private sector, corporate? All right. Interesting. Okay, well, I'm going to steer the conversations a little bit because, I think open data applies across the board for me especially, but I think we got a good mix here on the stage as far as both providing, consuming, as well as kind of the analyst side. I think Alex and I kind of share that. So first of all, I'm going to go with you, Alex. What is open data?
Okay, so open data itself is a neutral term. It has been used in many non-neutral ways, in a way that many things can be adapted to whoever is applying them and in the context. But fundamentally, I think the definitions that have been put out in the web for since 2007 at least have looked at different qualities of data which make it more open. Things like, is it free or not? Does it have a license or not, which makes it free to use, or anything else? And then perhaps the one that is controversial in some context, is it machine readable or not? This is something that I think we're seeing as a more recent contention just because of the administration here in DC's Obama administration's effort to define what it thinks open means, and it has advanced this machine readability into the conversation. Previous to that, a PDF was viewed as open data, something that many journalists and people working in NGOs and certainly developers might take issue with. But the fact is, if you release something inside of a PDF, technology means now make it much more easy to pull out the data and make it into something. But fundamentally, data is something that when we talk about it being open versus closed, it's accessible for the use and particularly the reuse of other organizations. And I think the business case for it is often that you'll see that reuse. That's something that we've seen the drum beaten on many different contexts, both in government and in media and NGOs, World Bank, to other organizations like Development Seed using their data. And from the government side, certainly the hope has been that you'll see multiple tertiary effects from the release of that open data and transparency and accountability outcomes, improved services, and then the big one, economic value, which has gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years, is with a number of research studies, particularly one by McKinsey, which says that the release of it could create a great deal of economic outcomes by governments in different countries. That's something that a lot of federal agencies have been betting on, from Commerce, which releases a great deal of economically significant data, and with a great effect actually by the Department of Health and Human Services, which has been leading the feds at least on that. Now open data is something that's been embraced by a lot of cities and states with varying degrees of success. And a lot more CIOs and other people who are in charge of those programs are looking at the potential impacts internally and across organizations. So there's some, the fuzziness that Ken maybe refers to is that open data that could be without license, free, machine readable, might still be behind a firewall or might be only available through an internal API, but not available to the public. People who are public interest advocates might say, well, that's not very open data. People working within large organizations that are heavily siloed might say, well, yes, it is. This goes to the sort of neutrality of the term and the political push and pull around how the actual use is. Is that enough?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty broad stroke. I think you hit on a lot of my questions, so I'm just going to throw my questions out here and go use you as the root material, I think. So good. All right. So Steve, why? So you kind of set up the second part of this is, so why was open data a priority for the World Bank, and is it still? And have you guys seen the success you wanted to see, or see the outcomes that you guys wanted to see originally with that original vision?
That's a loaded question.
Yeah, that's a big one.
I'd say it still is a priority. It is not the number one priority. It's now a kind of a foregone conclusion that is something we will try to get governments to do. Governments are not always, their appetite for openness depends on the government. So that is our primary client. So for those of you that are within government, some of this might resonate. So it is more or less mainstream. Right now, the difficulty is building that into actual operations within government. I think if you were to ask me, open data is a set of principles, as was stated, but it's a lot of hard work. And it is a bit of a gateway drug in terms of it's gotten a lot of people excited. There have been some papers that allude to economic benefit, but now we need to turn that into real benefit. So when we talk to clients, and our clients, again, are governments, they don't want to hear about open data. They want to hear about what kind of data and for whom and what are they going to do with it. And why do we care about that? Would we be more effective as a government if we have this information? Yes or no? And how? And they're looking for answers from us. So that has not been easy. Open data goes from a benefit to a distraction a bit. So open by itself is necessary but not sufficient. So is it budget data? Is it contract data? Is it results data? Is it telco data? Is it electricity? Information on subscribers and things like that. So the struggle we have now is operationalizing that. And those of you who are vendors and people that provide services to government, what is the market in real terms? Because we have to deal with that in country as well. So it's not enough to say the government should do this just because they should do this. That we need to create private sector markets. As the World Bank, our goal is not only to get governments to do this, but get private sector markets to pick this up, for this to have economic benefit for the average citizen and for the private sector as well. So it gets very, very complicated when you try to turn open data into real results, and that's where we are at this moment. And also given the fact that governments don't know what this really means for them, and we have to start to talk in words that they understand, and speak to sectors. This will help you in health because you will be able to solve this. Right now it's still just a label called open data, and we're all checking the box, but now we need to go beyond the box checking. The U.S. work of making getting it out there on exactly what that means for the U.S. government was excellent. Now it's the hard part of doing it and then making people care about it. So I think that's where we're at.
Actually, can I jump in on that?
Yeah,
'Cause
go
I think
ahead.
that it raises sort of an interesting question. I think, we can talk all day about the challenges of opening up data, and I think that we could have a good conversation on that and different issues that we've seen with institutions that are trying to do that. It's also really hard to consume open data, right? And I think that part of the problem, particularly in the social sector, is whereas when we're talking about GPS data and other things where there's really real obvious economic value, it attracts the sort of resources that are necessary to be able to do that sort of the processing side and the demand side. Whereas on the social side, we're still building up the kind of capacity that people need in order to be able to actually take that data and do something useful with it. And so while we're making some headways into the supply side of that data, and I think just scratching the surface of what's possible, I think we need to be thinking about the demand side at the same time.
The quick point on what you're getting at, because there's some really difficult issues here around power. Data is powerful if you can get insight from it. If you release it, people who have the ability to analyze it, which I think is the really important part of quote unquote big data, right? The ability to get insights from data and then apply it, not just the size of the data itself, then that can change context. And to your point, in terms of usability, often governments don't quite get that, or NGOs, to be fair, too. Right? If we just post this stuff, something will happen without thinking through who the desired audience for it is. One of the things I'm writing about today is actually this huge surge in comments filed to the Federal Communications Commission. Now, they actually released the comments as quote-unquote open data. What it actually meant, though, is XML and these gigantic files, which the normal person, even someone who's got some ability to go, say, through spreadsheets and a CSV file like me, couldn't get much insight out of. They had to actually release it to organizations that could do something with it. QUID out in the West Coast was able to do analysis and work with NPR. And then you've got the Sunlight Foundation here in DC, which converted it, cleaned it up, and made it into JSON files, and then released it through an API if you're interested, or made it easy to roll into one. And that enabled us to do lots of interesting things as public interest advocates to see how many of the comments were duplicates, how many of the comments were from experts, in this case about 600, or less than 1% of the total filed. We're now seeing maybe 3 to 4 million comments may have been filed on this. Data crunching, once you've actually cleaned it up, enables us to see who they were from. How many of them were duplicates? How many were from templates? How many of them were expert comments, et cetera, which is really important from this space. Now, the larger context is that regulatory rulemakings are actually supposed to be decided upon the strength of legal arguments, not upon public sentiment, right? This isn't a plebiscite, this isn't a referendum, but nonetheless, we can see through analysis of the data who's actually making those arguments, which is a democratic function, which people who care about that side of things might care quite a bit about. The thing about the power dynamic, though, is it's quite possible to release open data that's about services or about economic outcomes, which have nothing to do with democracy. And that, in fact, you see if you look across different countries around the world, the exact choice to do that and then wave the open government banner. Hey, we've released open data. We're open, except it has nothing to do with their campaigns, nothing to do with corruption, nothing to do with influence in politics, nothing to do with the deliberations or the decisions that are actually being made to run the country.
Yeah, I mean, and to add on to your definition from earlier of what is open, I mean, it's very one way, right? It's dumping a data set from 2 years ago from time to time and saying that this is open data instead of actually opening up in a real way, having a right API, giving people the ability to contribute their own information, contribute their own opinions, to put information in front of you that they think you should be looking at when you're involved in the decision-making process. And so that sort of very not timely and one-way way that open data is currently being employed within a lot of developing democracy projects is useful, definitely useful, but only scratching the surface of what we should really be aspiring for by when we talk about open data.
Yeah, I think the quality is also a concern more generally. Like, I guess it's to timeliness, but also it's just what you're putting in there. It's only as good as what you put in. What we're seeing very clearly in Africa and other countries is they're finally getting their head around the regulatory reform and loosening the legal restrictions and the policies. And they're starting to provide supply, but nobody's in between that and doing something is vacant. So all the structures are starting to emerge, but why aren't people doing anything? Why aren't they taking the data and doing something with it within government, even though we've released some of these policy issues around it?
So, I mean, when I think of development seed, I don't think of open data. I think of the experience and what you guys are doing. I think of, the maps, the interactions, that end result. I would say World Bank, I think more of open data, but then you guys have some of these, some really amazing visualizations and on top of it, and getting us from, I think, beyond just it being a raw resource to being an experience-based resource. How do we actually make decisions, take action on it? So at the World Bank, I mean, where have you guys seen the biggest challenges in getting people to actually, generate experience-based, more visualization, more decision-making tools? You guys have been doing a lot of that work, I think. I mean, where's the hardest thing in getting people to do this? Do you need more partners like Development Seed? Do we need 50 companies out there that just specialize in doing this, or? Yeah,
well, I mean, the way we've approached it so far, because we have a sales job to do even within ourselves on why this is important. So DevSeed is a bit unique. I'll do a little promo, but they helped us with our kind of our data.worldbank.org and then particular visualizations around certain development issues. But we do need those kinds of demonstration effects, even within ourselves and with government, to show what the possibility is, because to show them an Excel file is going to get you crucified in front of the Minister of Finance. So you need to show them what this would be solving, and that's where we need a small set of like-minded type folks that will help us build demonstrations of what this data would look like.
Go ahead. So quick point. People may not realize that Mapbox and Development Seed basically live in the same garage in DC. And they're both startups. They both created by the same kind of team of people. And Mapbox, if you haven't checked them out, is now venture funded, $10 million behind them. They were bootstrapped from the beginning, and they're profoundly about the use of open data. Terabytes of open data from satellite data that they've converted into data and then made into a product, cloud-based product, that they're basically competing with Esri and Google on now to provide. And I see them used a lot because it's open source tech. It uses open data, which lots of journalists like, and is easily integrated and kind of deploys on mobile devices, which if you've ever looked at things like, say, Silverlight or other kinds of interactives, don't look so good on the mobile devices we're all using now. And so Mapbox is profoundly a play based upon data they've gotten from the US government in hard drives, because it was too big to move over networks, and then have digitized and made more liquid. And they're, like I said, venture-based. They've been able to take that raw material and make it useful to thousands of people.
So Ian, would you say that the mapping data, I feel like is a win in demonstrating the value of open data and the power and potential, because you can do so much with plotting and interactions, and Mapbox is just damn sexy. I mean, it's just gorgeous. So it's like,
absolutely.
is this because it has context to everyone? Everyone relates to where they are in the world? Is it because it has a longer history? I mean, mapping data, along with weather data, I mean, is both contextual and been around for a while. Do we just need more time when it comes to social data and some of the other big data stuff?
I mean, I think Mapbox is successful because it solves a real problem, right? I mean, I think that from the very beginning, the point was, let's help developers who are trying to put information online and put map information online to be able to do it more easily. And as much as anything, I mean, Mapbox considers itself to be an API company as much as a mapping company or a data company. And along the way have done that by taking stuff like OpenStreetMaps and just making it more usable and accessible. If you wanted to build a website and not use Google before Mapbox was around, it was really hard to do that. And they just lowered the barrier to doing that and allowed people to start working with open and making it look good and can be able to compete with other things that are out there very well. And so, I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to what's the problem you're trying to solve. And while we, as you said, you think of us more as sort of a visualization and mapping company, and that's a lot of what our public-facing side is. A lot of the value, where we add the most value, is on the strategy side or on the back end side, in places where you would never necessarily see that we had anything to do with it. Knowing how to make data actually work and do something is something that is surprisingly not a question that's asked or answered well in a lot of these conversations. And that's why, if you don't get that right, it's hard to, what follows probably won't be that useful.
I mean, very frankly, though, the real issues we have to deal with are not technology issues per se. I mean, we're at a conference to talk about APIs and technology, but part of our role as the World Bank will be to do the hard slogging of capacity building and getting these things to work. But technology can accelerate the solution of the problem. It can expand the reach of who you can affect. It can drop some transaction costs, but it can't replace the country context and the incentives and the process that exists already. And having to change that process or change the mentality or build capacity within a government in an area where it needs to restructure itself, that's hard stuff, and unfortunately I don't know if tech can really crack that nut.
I mean, you mentioned power earlier on and access, and I think those two are often very closely aligned. You think about where there are asynchronies of information in society. If you look at the World Bank, for example, you've got an organization that spends an awful lot of money in development. Often that countries take out loans to get into them. And then there may not be a great deal of transparency, right, that's into how the money is spent, or more to the point, where and to what effect. Now, these are all things actually that open data and technology can provide insight to, and things like maps and mobile devices can give people on the ground insight that they never had before, because previously they would have had to go to a place, try to get access to the data itself, and then pore through it. And usually that's something, frankly, that journalists would have been doing before. Now you have a whole another group of people in NGOs, activists, other kinds of folks who are able to look at that data and then try to drill down into where the development dollars are going, and then to see if there's some accountability for how they've been spent and what the outcomes were. And if you look at development as a space, it's pretty clear there's a lot of opportunity for more transparency and accountability for those outcomes, which most people can look to as beneficial, right? Improved public services around how people access the things they think government should provide for them. Improved clean air, clean water, education, access to energy, transport. These are the things that development dollars are supposed to go to. In theory, open data that's released to the people on the ground there can give them insight into what's actually happening. In practice, there's some challenges around the granularity of the data and the quality of the data that organizations like the World Bank face. Because in many cases, people in large bureaucracies justifiably view information in file cabinets or on their hard drives as power. They don't see it as something that is everyone's to share, but their own. Every single big bureaucracy in this town, you can find people like that as well. And opening the data might just mean putting the spreadsheet online, but boy, when everyone gets to look at the data and how you've taken care of it or not, then maybe quality issues start coming to the fore, and also power issues.
Yeah, and this sort of speaks also to sort of changing the metric of if you want to actually open up data within institutions, how organizations are judged. And Steve, you know this from the World Bank experience. I mean, the World Bank made a lot of money off of the data that, or made some amount of money off of the data that it was basically collecting and selling for a long time. And this is the case in a lot of government, particularly developing country governments we go into, where there is data, it's being sold. Where there's anything of value, it's being sold. And the institution sees that, this agency or NGO sees that that unit sees that as important for justifying why they exist, that their ability to get revenue off of this. So once leadership changes the way they're being evaluated, makes it clear that no, that you're not going to lose your job because we're not making money on this anymore. In fact, you're more valuable to us because we're more able to achieve our objectives, because this is now getting out to 100 times as many people than it was before and having other effects. Like, that's where you can start to create, I mean, that's one of the things that needs to happen in order for agencies to start to get this data out.
I mean, very concretely in that example, the only thing that made the bank change was right from the top. It had to come from the top that this was going to change, and that a money-making revenue stream would turn into a public good, and that was a decision from the very top.
You know, I'm glad that came up. I mean, if you look around the U.S. and you start to follow the money, right? Because anyone who's, you know, cub reporter knows that's what you're supposed to do when you write about anything. Figure out where the money is flowing to and to whom. What you'll find is that lots of states and cities sell data. You'll see it a lot. So if you come to them and say, we want you to post this online and to take developer resources and, gosh, stand up an API, which then you're responsible for keeping up under demand. And by the way, if some of the vaunted, you know, aspirational outcomes of open data releases come to pass, there's going to be pressure upon not only bulk data resources, but upon APIs if organizations stand them up. There's a real question around that. And one that hasn't been resolved, by the way, here in DC. If Gray were still around, I'd push him on this a little bit, right? Who's going to say that data quality SLA is going to be there and uptime SLA is going to be there, service level of agreement, something people know pretty well. If you're asking developers and venture capitalists to back businesses and NGOs to make decisions based upon this data, who's responsible for keeping it up? When there's money changing hands, at least there's a clear reason or rationale. At the state or local level, the resources not only aren't there, but they're actually having to make choices about potentially not getting money from the private sector, where previously you had organizations buying data from them and then repackaging it to whoever would want to take the refined product. That's where there are some real challenges in the future, where the justifications made on release will have to be balanced against the actual revenue, the bottom line revenue that states and cities are getting, particularly as their budgets continue to be flat or even cut.
On the social side, we're starting to see some evidence that this stuff is got some economic benefit. I mean, for a long time we were talking about anecdotal stories about how this worked somewhere, but now it's starting to surface with McKinsey report, and I think AUSAID did one with Omidyar on the economic benefit, so you can see what your return on investment would be. But still, it's not quite the methodology for that, and the real meat inside those is very subjective. What is very true, though, is a lot of the donors and folks providing open data, if they invest in a manual process and they don't spend a little time on an API and a structure, they really get crushed by having to keep recreating those manual processes over and over again. And so the investment in an API, given the audience here, is a good investment. Takes a little bit extra time. You got to get your SLAs and your uptime and some of your specifications right, but it beats doing a manual job, 4 or 5 times a year or instantaneous or monthly.
So speaking specifically to government agencies, so one of the projects I worked on was, the open data mandate going around to agencies. I was specifically at the Department of Veterans Affairs. And speaking of revenue going away, I would say budget disappearing. Your database, your ownership and curation and management of a database is sustainment dollars. You're where that people go for that record, that veterans records. And so there's very little incentive for you to wrap that in an API and potentially make that database go away, because your entire existence is around that. And this is a top-down mandate. This is Obama saying, and you know, you got to do this. And this is OMB attaching certain things.
Historically,
so is
that has meant that
top-down?
people do it, though.
I mean, is it? I don't see top-down being the way in government. I see it's got to be a bottom-up. We've got to figure out how to bridge these people, you know, the actual people down in the trenches. So what, I mean, when it comes to government, what would you say, Ian, as far as top-down, bottom-up, combo?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be a combo, right? So you have to have both culture change at sort of the working level, and the places where we've made the most progress have been where there is some sort of high-level cover and somebody at the working level who's able to take advantage of that and pry some doors open that wouldn't have been open otherwise, and then people on the consumer side, whether it's companies or civil society or whoever, who are advocates for that once that's out, who keep that agency's feet to the fire to keep maintaining it, keep it open, and show the value of it, and help people to help people win, help people look good as a result of that, and that's sort of the ecosystem that seems to work the best.
The example I like to share a lot comes out of New York City. It's always good to get out of DC and look at what other places are doing around these spaces. And if you haven't looked at what a fellow named Mike Flowers did, take a look. He was the first director of analytics for the city of New York. He came in under former Mayor Bloomberg, who's a pretty data-driven guy. I'm sure many of you are quite aware. And he was given the ability, the mandate, to get together a team of young data scientists, basically stat nerds. He went and got capacity to do this inside of government themselves, and then went around to agencies and started to break down the data silos and collect data. Now, what's critical is, yeah, he had a top-down mandate, he had a big title, he was able to hire people with tech talent to go through, clean the data, to use open source tools to make infer insights from it. But the key is that he was then able to go to New York City's regulatory agencies and say, can you give us examples of enforcement actions and sort of the tags for what the people look like, or the organizations or businesses look like, that are committing infractions, and then we'll match that against the cleaned up data we have. Now, if you look at what New York's regulatory agencies, they actually do things like trying to find where there's a higher risk of fires. And then they targeted their fire inspections to where there might be apartments that were divided up, which had a higher risk, and were able to actually then credibly claim they saved the lives of firefighters. They're able to see which pharmacies were responsible for the most number of prescriptions of painkillers, using, again, data and existing patterns, and target enforcement at those places. Again and again and again, combining data, cleaning it up, making it useful, and then giving public servants the ability to go and make better decisions in terms of the targeting of enforcement. That's an actual return on investment for the process of making data more open. And to be clear, if you've ever worked with data, and I know lots of you have or are entrusted with it, you know it's ridiculously frustrating to clean it up. Most of the time in data journalism, something I spent the last year researching, is spent cleaning. It's like 80% of the process. If you saw a New York Times story come out recently about data janitors, that's what they're talking about. Talking about going through very dirty data and then making it useful and clean, and then it can go into your API. If you're expecting anyone else to use the data, it's got to be clean enough. Otherwise, you're basically doing the garbage in, garbage out outcome. And anyone who's trying to make a policy decision based upon it is frankly screwed. And it's your responsibility.
So what sort of tools, Ian, do you recommend besides, Mapbox as the end delivery goal, or APIs? I mean, as far as doing this really hard work, technically, what are the tools in the toolbox that people here should consider looking at?
Yeah, I mean, so the nice thing about our approach is that we use a lot of different tools. We don't have a particular product that we're pushing. Well, we do love the folks at Mapbox, and we use them a lot, and we think they're great for getting maps up. I mean, we do espouse very much we are an open source shop that uses open source tools, that reinvests in open source, and likes to have a really robust set of tools out there. So, I mean, honestly, to kind of go back to what I was saying earlier, I think the biggest tools that we use are more on kind of the strategy side, like the strategy that we provide, even if we're not doing any technical work, can have more impact than any particular technology. And then to Alex's point, like the next set of tools that end up being really important are the data cleaning and data processing side of things, which no one really sees. You know, this is before you're even publishing or making this data available. And so, by way of example, we worked with the National Library of Medicine to take all of the prescription drug data that the FDA was putting out, which is terabytes of data, gigabytes every day that they're releasing. And their previous process took 2 weeks to process new data sets. And so they were only able to update their site basically every 6 months because it just took so long to process it. And we were able to get them down just using Python scripts to 45 minutes from a 2-week process to a 45-minute process. And that actually made the data usable, timely, made that service a lot more helpful, made that service something that people could rely on. And then as far as the API tools themselves, I mean, we do pick from, we'll use Python, we'll use Node.js, we'll use just an API off of a CouchDB, or Firebase we've used in different places. A lot of it depends on the institution that we're working with, where their data is already, what they're comfortable maintaining, what the likely uses are of this, and who their users are. So yeah, and I think that's an advantage. I mean, where I've seen APIs, there's a lot of ways I've seen these projects go wrong or open data projects go wrong, but a lot of, definitely we want to have a business case around opening data. We want to have business models around it, and you've written some great stuff on that. I think one of the disadvantages of the product sort of approach is people trying to bend the data need around a product, which doesn't always necessarily lead to the best outcome. So I think that we're really proud of being kind of a best tool for the job kind of set of folks, and I think that's something and investing back in making those tools better.
Glad you mentioned CouchDB. One of my favorite things that a Code for America fellow ever did was take the USDA data on farmers markets and use CouchDB to spin up, I think at like in half an hour, an API for them, which then someone else could then create a mobile app to say, what's the nearest farmer's market near you? Boom. So you release of bulk clean data, API spun up on top of it, and then there's a mobile application which enables someone who doesn't need to know about open data or APIs or any of this can simply say, where's the nearest farmer's market? Like that's a nice, clear value chain for something people actually want.
But what happens if the guy goes to college and he disappears? One of the challenges we have is the sustainability of those things. Yeah. We as the World Bank, we don't do tools. Like we find that we do best of breed or whatever fits. And the work is in the country, I'm talking, not at headquarters. And that's context, context, context. The one thing we learned the hard way is there's an IT context in each of these countries. So just because Mapbox is the best tool in the universe, if there's nobody in the country that knows how to use that technology, or if there is and they're 10 times more expensive than somebody that knows Python or PHP, then you go with what you've got the capacity to do. So that's the reality. Maybe it doesn't apply in this instance, but in some of these various economies of technical economies or data economies, you have to work with what fits. And that is economic just as well as engineering.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I see APIs and open data, I always put things into 3 buckets. It's either a technical building block, it's a business, or it's a political one. So when it comes to the business and political side of influencing, either internally or externally at the World Bank, what other tools do you have? Just showing people the value. How do you overcome some of the political hurdles around opening up data and getting countries to invest in the future?
Honestly, that's the struggle we're having now is after you move this beyond a presidential mandate and you try to put it into lending and get a government to say that's a priority over roads or education, they don't understand that it's not a choice, it supports those things. So trying to convey to them that investing a bit in open data or applied, you don't want to say open data, you want to say something around service delivery or more engagement, or value for money. Why would they pick that? So the power of the bank is that we do have money to give, and we have a relationship with government very directly, and we have to make that case to them that this will help in the future. This is an investment that you need to make your services better to your citizens and to make your government more responsive.
So when an NGO comes to DevSeed, is it more, here, take this raw resource and make it into something, or is it more, we want that, go find the data to make that?
It depends. Yeah, I mean, we get a lot of different sorts of requests, but usually, the things that we're looking for are not, hey, we want X, and we've already decided what it looks like, and we don't necessarily have the data for it, but we want this thing that somebody else had. We usually don't end up working on those projects. Where the projects we take are the ones where, hey, we have this really this interesting problem. We have this data. We think it tells a story. We think there's a really important trend here, and we're trying to figure out either how to tell the story better from the data that we have available, or how to take this set of data and make it open in a way that other people can do things with it. So, one example, we did a lot of stuff around Afghanistan elections, and taking, the goal was to be able to understand what happened in the election and take all the data around the polling station level data to see, how there was fraud, definitely, but how bad was it and where, and how, is this, what's the scale? Is this election mostly good or mostly bad? And so that international institutions could figure out kind of what to do about it. Well, along the way, there was a lot of really good things that we could do as well, and other problems we could solve. So we were able to get our hands on the locations of all the polling stations a few weeks before Election Day. And so when the Election Commission closed 392 polling stations just a week before Election Day without really publishing where those were, we were able to build a quick little mobile app that would allow people to find their closest open polling station. And it was basically the only, it was used by a couple thousand people, which we were actually pretty impressed with, given how short time we had to get the word out about it. But just having that data out there, yeah, I mean, the problems arise, and having the data in formats where you can quickly do things with them and deploy them are where the best projects come from.
That's true here in the U.S. too. The polling place locators you might have seen on Google or Facebook or a lot of these other places in 2012, and in fact, you probably see this fall, is often driven by the Voting Information Project, which is an effort to put open data about the location of that basic democratic infrastructure. And other countries are trying to adopt similar approaches to making that kind of basic thing available as a data format. Sometimes some simple things about where things are, though, it can be quite controversial. It's not just about polling places. It can also be about other kinds of incidents. You're much too diplomatic to bring it up, but when the State Department's data became more open around its cables, and the Defense Department's data became more open, and a lot of journalists spent a great deal of time cleaning up that data, that showed up in The Guardian and the New York Times as maps of what was happening in Iraq, of who was saying what to whom. More recently, there's a project called Offshore Leaks, which was 10 times as big as what WikiLeaks ever got, which showed where money was moving offshore. And then you had, I think, 80 journalists from 40 different countries taking that data, cleaning it up, analyzing it, and showing where the money was moving, extrajudicially, extraterritorially, et cetera. Again, a lot of time spent in making the data useful across lots of formats, lots of different proprietary bits. Once they got through it, then they could start doing analyses.
So, I mean, that kind of brings me to the other side of the coin here is there's a lot of bad that can happen here. I mean, a lot of the naysayers, I know we have a few people that we know of in the space that are pretty vocal that are saying, open is not good. A lot of bad can come from this. So what's the downside of open data, at least for this audience, as far as having a critical eye and just being cautionary?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I approach open data with a similar lens of just speech in general, that the answer to bad data is more data, and more open data will help clean deficiencies in previous data. I think there's certainly real concerns around personal information and privacy, and the degree to which individuals can be targeted and have their privacy violated, not through any actions of their own or any decisions on their own. And so that is an area, particularly with health records, which we heard about earlier, and others, where we need to be careful as a community. not just what we're doing with our own data set, but be thinking to the broader sort of mosaic effect of all of these things being out there and how we're contributing to that. And we need to, as a community, be responsible and thoughtful about that in order to be able to head off like real problems down the road.
So I'd put these things in 3 buckets. The extent to which open data efforts enable governments to claim they're adopting open government, which for me is much larger, right? Rule of law, free and fair elections, access to the courts, democratic norms, essentially. Press freedom is a big one for me because I don't particularly like seeing what happens to journalists in some of these countries that are claiming to be open but aren't. That's the first one. The second is what Ian alluded to around privacy. Governments, in particular, have an awful lot of information about us. We've got a lot of discussion around surveillance and the NSA, but just go back to the IRS and Social Security, right? We have to be very thoughtful about what they have. Other countries without a Privacy Act, like we have here, or a Bill of Rights, that are doing the same kinds of activities may not be legally mandated, or even culturally thoughtful about these. And so what you're seeing, say, in a country like India, which is also adopting open data on a large scale, is lots of government records going online which have not been scrubbed or redacted and may have information like people's names or addresses. And the unfortunate third tertiary effect of that may be that people who express political views may be more findable on the ground because of that, which can be problematic to say the least. If you saw what happened around the gun map, anyone hear of that? In New York back in, I think, 2012, where you had a paper post a searchable map of regulatory data with gun licenses. It made people findable that perhaps shouldn't have been, not just prison guards, but maybe targets of abuse, exes, et cetera, who'd bought handguns who weren't previously findable. So I think that's 2 major concerns. The third one is actually maybe more existential. Who are you empowering by releasing this data in terms of who has access to it, who can use it? How are the outcomes filtering down to the people in society that you're actually wanting to see whose lot improved, right? If you're making just smartphone apps, well, there you go. You've limited it to only people who can afford a smartphone and a data plan. There's a lot more of us who can do that now, but it needs to be something which diffuses to everyone if you want that outcome as opposed to something else.
I think opening up data, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with it. If you're going to be opening up data, you got to think it through at all these levels and be somewhat responsible to it.
Yeah, we're on the hook for that in fragile state type environments. We just don't have the liberty of being open in some of those contexts. Yeah, for sure.
So, questions from the audience. You guys have been awfully quiet. No one interrupted. Anything you want to talk about?
Thank you. All right, so I work for a customer, a federal customer, and Alex, I think you started off by talking about this scoping and context. So we're pushing the notion of openness in an otherwise closed culture with a closed network. It's highly protectionist. It's highly regional, going to your point about tech skill set, right? So not all places have the right skill set. There's a lot of desktop ownership of data. There's no corporate champion for it, but there is this hue and a cry for it at the grassroots level. So we want to be open in an inherently closed environment where the release of the information can be catastrophic. So the more you open, your risks go through the roof. But we think we know what's best, so we're trying to pitch this. Do you have any suggestions?
You worked at a large government institution recently.
Yeah, I mean, it's great, and we've had issue. This reminds me of some of the fights we're fighting right now with groups that are being funded by development organizations that, because the development organization got the contracting wrong, aren't being required to make this public good actually open and usable and available. And so in that situation, one of the strategies that you could employ is just taking what's there and figuring out how to get some of that data and make it available in a way that shows the value, particularly since you know that there are people who are asking for it and will use it. and create momentum, create positive pressure and publicity around that in a way that gets people asking, well, why isn't more of this available? Why isn't this also available? And actually being deliberate in showing where the gaps are, and that this is what we have, but this is what's missing right now, and this is what is sitting on somebody's desk right now and could be available, starts to get those questions in front of the right people who can put pressure on public institutions to change.
And I'd note this too. A lot of organizations, particularly ones that have legitimate concerns about leaks, may have mission needs in terms of information sharing internally. And if you look at the research and evidence around the amount of time that analysts spend doing information polls or searches, it adds up hugely over the course of a year, even a given day. So if you can move the activity away from people searching a god-awful intranet or asking for data over email to more collaborative information sharing environment that's contained within a silo with level of information access, that's one area where technology's gotten a bit better. You could potentially make a pretty good business case that the information retrieval costs across silos within the organization would be vastly reduced, which directly relates to people's mission. That's the openness that's not relevant to it being freely published online or it being licensed for use by anyone. It's the openness inside about making data more liquid. The business case for releasing data, well, I'd point you to Transparency International study, which just came out this week, that looked at secrecy laws across 15 countries and the EU and found that actually they were negative in terms of corruption effects and in terms of national security concerns. So it's possible to do this in a way that's thoughtful and considered that actually enhances people's mission. And if you don't align it with people's mission, I don't think you're going to get it done within government.
Given my experience here and in developing countries, embedding works. This whole Code for America code that spun into Code for Africa, just you need to find champions. To find champions, they have to know how they can be champions. They have problems that technology maybe and open data can solve. Stick somebody next to them to help them do that. And that is working to some extent within government, that embed a fellow for a period of time, and their job is to automate, make easier a person's life, and then get them some credit for that, so they understand how it benefits their career. I mean, we're talking about real things here. So, and the Code for America model did work to some degree, and then it spun into Code for Africa, and now that's moving along. But and then it gives opportunities to that young person as well. So it starts to edge towards an ecosystem while you bang away on getting senior leadership. You've got to get the top to come around. But while you're doing that, try to build some champions with little things. You got to start that process.
Yeah, if you get one person who's at the top who says, we need to do this, you're supposed to do this, and then assign one person to release one data set, that in of itself can go a long way. The key is that that person who's now the curator, right, the owner, the steward of the data, right, that they're insulated in their risk by that person up top. That insulation of risk is critical in these organizations. So, I mean, and you can go back to more fun things like Skunk Works, you know, in World War II, if you want to talk about that kind of work, or what DARPA does, which are, you know, intrinsically high-risk, high-reward projects, and look at the outcomes that they've had from those efforts. This is something more aspirational, maybe.
All right. I would add in just slow, simple API evangelism, just little bits. All right. I'm going to end on that note because that's how I roll.